Hey there, it's Commander Davis. Now, quite a few people have asked me about my joystick maps and how I put them together, and I thought I'd put together a series on how I go about building these maps. I'm wanting to rebuild my maps from scratch to allow me to do some various things with VR and also with voice attack. So I'm going to be starting from the absolute basics and building the map up from scratch. And the first thing I'm considering is shooting weapons. Now, with most space sims, you pull the trigger and your weapons fire. With Elite, you're allowed to group your weapons into primary and secondary weapon groups. So primary, and then your secondary weapons group may be a different weapon. In this case, they're both the same. And of course, you can fire both weapons groups at the same time. If we take a look at the HOTAS itself, we can start to appreciate the problem we've got here. You see, there's only one fire button. There are other buttons on the stick, but not all of these are going to be useful. For example, the pinky button. This is not a fire button. The pinky button is a shift button. It always has been on my joystick maps, and pretty much always will be. The only time it's not a shift button is when the map is simple and I can use it for things like flight assist off. Which really just leaves us with these two buttons if we want discrete buttons on the joystick. Button 2 would seem to be the obvious solution, however it's quite a stretch to hit this, and while it's fine for the odd thing like shooting missiles or torpedoes, using it constantly for shooting cannons or lasers is not really a viable option. Button 3 I typically use for countermeasures. Again, it's not that easy to press for extended periods of time, and it's also quite difficult to press at the same time as holding the trigger. You need to change your grip on the joystick, and that makes access to some of the other buttons tricky. My solution was to rely on the fact that my joystick map is quite complex, and that I have two modifier buttons programmed, a shift button and an alt button. By itself, the trigger does exactly what you'd expect. It's the primary fire button and will fire the primary fire group. Press shift and the fire button becomes secondary fire, firing the secondary fire group. Pressing alt or shift and alt and it fires both fire groups. It essentially sends two button presses to the game, simulating two trigger buttons on the joystick. While this solution works logically, in reality it's not that good. Trying to remember which buttons to press to get which fire group going is difficult, especially in the heat of combat. There is also another problem with this setup. If you notice, I go from primary to secondary, and my primary just shot off a single round there as I let off the shift too early. This has caused me problems because I normally have the kill warrant scanner as my secondary weapon, and while scanning people who may not necessarily be eligible to be shot at, I'm then letting off a round and incurring a fine. So that's part of the reason that's led me to rethink what we're doing with the fire setup. Something that has led me to spending quite a lot of time sat in the ship during the training missions just thinking about what I would press under pressure in a combat situation, so that the button presses become second nature and you don't have to think about them. Having discounted all the buttons on the stick, my attention turned towards the hats and whether or not I could use those as a secondary fire button. The issue is that there's a lot of muscle memory that's been built up here, both in terms of the map that I've been using for Elite Dangerous and the maps I've been using during my history of owning these sticks, which is well over a decade now. For example, if I was to use the hat on the side of the stick, I normally use that for rudder control and for moving forwards and backwards should I want a digital rather than analog control over the throttle. It's quite handy when landing in Elite and also for putting full reverse on. Using the point of view hat would sacrifice the ability to look around if you didn't have a VR headset or something like Track IR, so that's not really a viable option for something that's going to be released to the public. For a while I was considering using the castle hat. Historically I have used this for targeting, and in my Elite map it is also mapped to targeting. However, it's in a comfortable position to press the up direction while in combat, while also pressing the trigger. The problem is, with the shape of the hat and the position of your hands, is under pressure I could accidentally press left and right, which may cause other actions to happen that I don't particularly want. So I eventually discounted that. which really just leaves us with this hat. Historically, this has been the bind whatever functions I have left over hat, and in Elite I've used it to bind power management. Sadly, the position of this hat means it's not really comfortable to use for prolonged periods of time. So the conclusion is that there is no second fire button on the stick, which means we need to look to the throttle. Using the throttle for the secondary fire button does add a nice symmetry insofar as you've got left and right hand side fire buttons. However, it's difficult to think where that button might be on the throttle. The throttle has 4 discrete buttons of its own, but the button 1 on the mini stick is just too hard to press, and buttons 2, 3 and 4 I have other plans for and are not really in the right place. In fact, there's only really one hat that makes sense, and if you look at my existing map, that hat has already been used for some fire controls. So if we sacrifice boost and the hyperspace and supercruise functionality, along with some other lesser mappings that are on that hat, we can turn that into a fire control hat. Of course, the proof of the pudding is in the eating, and we also need to find homes for our now dispossessed functions. So I think what I'm going to do is try and map this new layout, find some temporary homes for at least boost and jumping to supercruise and hyperspace, and see how it fares under an actual combat situation. If we're happy with that, we can then look at mapping some of the other controls, which we will do in another episode. Cheers.